Okay, everyone, welcome. This video is all about how you can make a player that can move left and right using some keys from your keyboard. So let's go ahead and get started. Of course, this is processing, so let's start off with just the bare essentials. So we need our setup function and our draw function. And while we're here, let's go ahead and set up our size. Actually, I'll make my window a little bigger. I'll do 1200 by 800 pixels. And I'll go ahead and put a background in my draw. I like to press play right away. Let's just test that. Yep, there it is, so that's good. And so we know we want to have a player that can move left and right based off the arrow keys. So I'm going to make a class for the player. Of course, I'm going to call that player, so the name of the tab matches the name of the class. Let's go ahead and make our player class. The first thing we have to do is think about what variables our class needs. So I think we need an X, we need a Y, so we need the position. I'm going to have my player be a square for now. I'm going to go ahead and put both a width and a height though, just in case if down the line I want it to be, not a square. I can do both. Later on, if we replace this with an image, that might have a different width and height, so this helps us have that. If you want, you can go ahead and have a color. I'm not going to bother with that today, but you could have that. So that's the variables. We also need the constructor. And so the constructor is, of course, a function that has the same name as the class. And the goal of the constructor is to give every variable in the class an initial value. So this should initialize all of these variables. Now we have to think, do you want to hard code this for every player? Maybe you do. Or do you want to possibly customize this for every player? For the player, that's not so important because for what I'm about to make here, there's only going to be one player. But I'm thinking, I might want to down the line have more than one player. Maybe they have different positions, maybe different sizes. In either case, I think I'm going to go ahead and make it so I can adjust all of these down the line, which means since I want to adjust these need to be parameters. So I'm going to come in here and make some parameters to represent my four variables. Make sure that whatever you name these parameters, they are different from your class variables. So I'm going to say something like starting X, starting Y, starting width, and starting height. Cool. And then I'll just use these starting variables to initialize my class variables. So X equals starting X. I'll go ahead and copy that. Oops. And then Y is starting Y. Width is starting width. And height is starting height. Okay. So that's my constructor. And let's go ahead and make some functions here, of course, as well. So we have to think about what do we want our player to do. Well, we want it to first be drawn. So I'm going to call this render. You can call it display or something like that. I'm going to call it render. And for me, I want to make my player a square. So I'm going to use the rect function, just in case if down the line I want it to have a different width and height. I'm just going to do that. Now at this point I want to test my code, make sure I haven't messed anything up. So I'm going to come back over here to my setup and draw tab, and I'm going to go ahead and make a new player. So I have a little section up here declaring my vars. Let's make a new player. I'll call it P1. Then in my setup, I'm going to initialize my vars. And in here, I'm going to say P1 is going to be equal to, of course, making it a player. So the way I do that is I have to call my constructor. The way you do that for any class is you say the word new, and then you put in your constructor. But of course, it's freaking out right now, but that's because my player constructor expects for parameters, for arguments to this, right? Where they represent the X, Y, width, and height. So now this is where I can say what player one's X, Y, width, and height are. So I think for the X and Y, I'm going to start it off at the middle of the screen. For the width, I'm going to make it maybe 50. Same for the height for now. Cool. And then, of course, down here in my draw, I'm going to go ahead and render my player. So I'm going to call my render function. If I press play, yep, there's my player, so that's good. Of course, if I press some keys, you know, nothing happens. So what I have to do is now need to move my player. The way I like to do this, this is good for things down the line, especially if you want to move in 4 directions or something like that. This is very helpful. Is I like to have a boolean for every direction. So I'm going to make a boolean called is moving left, and I'm going to make another one called is moving right. And of course, this declares the variables. I also need to initialize them in my constructor because the constructor must initialize every variable. And so now that I have 2 more, I have to make sure that these are initialized. But then here comes the question is, do I have to initialize them with parameters, or can I just make them equal to something here? Well, since I don't want to customize what these are for every different player, I don't need parameters for these. I know I want these to start off as false no matter who you are, no matter what player you are. So since I know I want these to be initialized to false for anyone, I can just in here make them equal to false. That will make it so the player is not moving in any direction when you first start up the game. Cool. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a move function here, and I'm going to use my booleans to control the movement. So I'm going to say if my variable is moving left is true, then I'm going to move my player to the left. At this point in time, I actually think it might be useful to have a speed variable because that will control how fast it moves. So I'm going to come back up here and make a speed variable really quick. So I'm going to say int speed. And you might could have this as a parameter if you want that to be different at different points in time. For me, I'm just going to make it like 10. And so now I'm coming back to my move function. If is moving left is true, I move it left. I know left is controlling the x position, so I'm going to be changing x. If I want it to move left, I'm subtracting, so I'm going to say x minus equals speed. This is the same as saying x equals itself minus speed. This is just another way of writing this. I'm also going to come on down here and do the exact same thing, but for is moving right. So if is moving right is true, I'm going to do the same thing. I know moving right is still changing the x position, but if I'm moving to the right, I'm actually adding to the x. So I'm just going to do x plus equals speed. And again, that's the same as saying x equals x plus speed. There's no benefit either way to these. You just choose whichever one you like the best. Now I'm going to come in here and call my move function. And you'll see if I press play, start pressing some keys, nothing happens. That's because at this point in time, my booleans, they were initialized to be false. If you look at my functions, I never told them to become true at any point. Well, since I want these to become true when I press a key, I'm actually going to make those true within my key pressed function. And I always recommend that if you need a key pressed function in your program, always have that key pressed function be in your setup and draw tab. If you start having it in different classes, it starts to get confused when if you have multiple versions of these, it might get confused about which one to run. So I always only have one key pressed function in my setup and draw. So for me, I'm going to make it if I press the A key, I move left. If I press the D key, I move right. So I'm just going to check that key. So if my key is A, I want to make is moving left true. And for my code to know that I want that, or for the code to know that I want is moving left to become true inside player 1, what I have to do is say p1 dot is moving left equals true. Otherwise, if I equals true for assignment, if I only say is moving left equals true, it doesn't know what is moving left is, and that's because that exists inside the class. So I have to tell it to look inside a specific player. Well, in this case, I only have one player, so that's P1. And while I'm here, I'll go ahead and do the same thing for the D key. So if key is D, then do the same thing, but do that for is moving right. Now, of course, this makes them true. They need to become false at some point. I'm just going to do that with a key released. If you have taken my 103 class, you've seen this methodology before when we made Pong. So this says when I release a key, if that key I released was A, then I'm going to make that Boolean false. Same thing if I release my D key, make that Boolean false. Now if I come here, if I press the A key, oh, there it goes. If I press the D key, there it goes. And whenever I release my keys, it stops moving. So there we go. So that's how you make a player move left or right.